So in this video, I'm going to talk about the recent shooting which occurred in Buffalo, New York. I assume everyone is aware by now of basically what happened. There was an 18-year-old who seemingly had been radicalized by racial rhetoric he found in places like 4chan and the Daily Stormer, and the ideas that he got from those places in conjunction with being inspired by previous mass shooters convinced him to go and kill, I believe, 13 people at a grocery store, the vast majority of which were black, and he did so for explicitly racial reasons. He wrote a manifesto, which is being widely talked about now, which makes that very clear. So the first thing to say, obviously, is that killing innocent people is evil, and aside from being evil, also very stupid. The kid who did this was not someone who had thought these ideas through very clearly, very obviously. He called black people invaders of the country, despite the fact that most of them are here literally, because they were brought here forcibly. He's somehow under the delusion that shooting a few people in a grocery store will make fewer people of non-white ethnicity come here in the future. And he thinks that doing this kind of thing is going to cause a backlash on the part of the left that is going to cause some counter backlash on the account of the right, and the things he talks about are insane. For instance, he talks about him wanting to cause a gun grab so that conservatives will be forced to violently defend their gun rights. It's obviously a very delusional character. He's a very narcissistic character. He talks about how he had no choice but infamy in his manifesto. And he also talks about going back and forth in his already short life between different extreme ideologies. So obviously someone who wasn't particularly stable intellectually or clearly mentally. So that all should go without saying, but nonetheless, probably best to say it, especially before I say the rest of what I'm going to say in this video. Because what people would like to do is to use this incident as an excuse to further a long list of lies. And I think, if anything, doing that is counterproductive towards the end of stopping shootings like this from occurring, because one of the problems that happens in society is that an idea will become taboo, and if someone comes to find arguments for that idea in the first place, if the idea is wrong, they don't feel comfortable enough to discuss the idea to be shown why it's wrong, and in the second place, even worse, if the idea is true, or at least if they perceive it's true, then they end up feeling a deep sense of alienation from society that can drive them a bit crazy, I think. And so the rest of this video, for the most part, is going to be about certain just true facts about the world that as a society we should come to deal with the knowledge that we can accept these things as being true without having to think that we should treat anyone indecently on account of their ethnic background. Now, the simplest, I suppose, and first sort of lie to expose here is people are pretending as if they think that if an idea inspires an act of domestic violence, well, then the people who spread that idea need to be shut down, and the idea itself is repugnant. Now, of course, no one actually thinks this. No one actually thinks that because of the mass murders of John Brown or Nat Turner, that the abolition movement should have been ended and slavery should have continued. You could apply the same sort of argument to say the civil rights movement should have been ended, or that that guy who shot up the congressman's baseball game implies that the idea is that progressives like Bernie Sanders spread today should be ended. Like, no one actually thinks this. We all understand that crazy people just exist in all parts of the ideological spectrum. And so now people, I think they're not lying consciously, but they're lying to themselves and pretending to believe this kind of thing that they don't believe. Another thing I'm seeing a lot on social media and in articles is this trope about the white mass murderer. So it's worth briefly noting, this is from the New York Times and their analysis. I think it was people who had killed 4 more people, that 3/4 of the suspects were black, which is obviously vastly overrepresented. You can look at this data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics from 1976 to 2005. Black people accounted for about 41% of people who killed multiple victims. You can also look at data from the Justice Department. Black people are overrepresented among people that commit hate crimes, and white people are slightly underrepresented. So it is true that there's a trope that we're exposed to a lot in the media of the white mass murderer, hate crime offender. But that is not reflective of reality. That's the media. That is an example of the media instilling a false stereotype in the minds of many people. Now, another thing I'm seeing talked a lot about is this idea that there are all these black people who when they are accused of committing violence in the presence of police, they're killed. But there are all these white people who, when they commit mass murder in front of the police, they're somehow brought in safely. And why is that? But in fact, if you compare the rate at which people are killed by police to the rate at which they assault or kill police themselves, black people are far less likely than white people to be killed by police. And to be specific, for every black person who kills or assaults a police officer, there are 5 black people who are killed by police in this country. But for every white person who kills or assaults a police officer, there are 8 white people killed by police in this country. So, you can also use a homicide rate as a benchmark and only look at people who are shot while unarmed and not aggressing. And you come to the same conclusion that whites are far more likely to have been killed by police under such circumstances. So that these anecdotes, and some of these anecdotes aren't even real examples of innocent people being killed by police, but some of them are, but they're not representative of the general pattern in society. And so, again, this is the media telling you something that is misleading. The most informative thing to say about these lists that I keep seeing on Twitter and the like is just the fact that you should take note that people know the names of white murderers and black victims, but do not know the names of white victims and black murderers. And that tells you much more about society's biases than these unrepresentative lists do in the way that they're commonly being interpreted. Now, the shooter, he was motivated by a set of theories that people are now talking a lot about. And one of the big ones is this idea of white replacement. People are calling it a conspiracy theory. Now, of course, it is just a fact that no one denies that white people are going to become a minority in the country fairly soon. Certain left-wing politicians like Joe Biden famously called this a good thing. And this change that is occurring is pretty substantive. In the first place, we're switching from a society which is mostly made up of people who do not consider their race or ethnicity to be very important to who they are, to a society that will be mostly made of people who do think that race and ethnicity is very or extremely important to who they are. Now, the consequence of holding that kind of ethnic identity is a degree of racial bias. You can see this in discrimination experiments, where you have 2 groups of people that are faced with a similar question about what to do in a given situation. And in one case, the situation involves a black person and the other a white person, but otherwise everything is identical. And when you analyze lots of these experiments, what you find is that white people on average don't exhibit significant racial discrimination, but that the black participants in these studies do. And so, people talk a lot about institutional discrimination, and that idea of institutional discrimination is itself a lie, as we're going to talk about in a minute. But we're going to move into a society that has a lot of just everyday kind of immediate personal bias going on as we move into a society which is primarily comprised of non-white people, at least if the subcultures of those minorities continues to promote the kind of bias that it currently does. Now, I want to emphasize again that obviously murder is evil and you should treat people of all race and ethnic groups decently. But, that's true, but it is also true that ethnic diversity in an area turns it to shit, broadly speaking. That research has shown that the more diverse an area is, the more people in that area say they don't trust the people around them, the more likely the people in that area are to be suicidal, and the more likely that area is to have a high rate of crime. You look at schools, and it turns out that having lots of black students in a school predicts worse academic achievement for white students, and a higher suicide risk, and a higher rate of being bullied. You can even look at interracial marriages and the fact that they're much more likely than average to end in divorce. We can talk about politics and the profound effect that racial diversity has already had on our politics. The easiest snapshot of that is U.S. presidential elections, right? And this particular graph only goes up to 2012, but we all know how white people voted in 2016 and 2020 for Trump. So that from 1976 to 2020, in every election, the white voters on net voted for the Republicans, so that all the national power that the Democrats have had over that time period has been due to the existence of growing non-white minorities in the country. Now, you may say, why do this right now? It seems like I'm justifying the actions of this killer. And so, I want to make clear it again. I hope that that kid, as I understand New York law, this probably can't happen, but in an ideal world, that kid would be shot in the head. But it would be wrong to let his act not only cause the death of the people who he shot and the suffering of those people's families and that community, but to, on top of that, let the left use this as an opportunity to continue to lie to people about all of these issues. And so in my own, obviously very small way, this is me contributing to resisting that. And speaking of, resisting lies that are a bit uncomfortable to talk about, the next one is probably one of the most uncomfortable to talk about. And it concerns just the inability in the American public to talk about the influence that Jewish individuals have had on our political system. I was talking, about the voting before of ethnic minorities. And now I want to move into talking about some data from this paper, Marginality and Liberalism Among Jewish Elites. This was written by, as Jewish authors, peer-reviewed sort of mainstream journal. And they're the only people that do this kind of research, by the way, are Jewish academics. I think if anyone else did it, it would seem very anti-Semitic, and so that and the fact that the Jewish community is very interested in itself, and so you have these kind of papers being done. What they did, I think, around 1980 is they had this survey administered to what they called a kind of representative sample of American elites. These were people that worked at top news organizations, people in the military, people in politics, people in big business. These sorts of groups of people, they managed to get a bunch of them to fill out a survey about their political orientation. And what they found was that at that time, the American elite, excluding Jewish elites, actually leaned to the right politically. But because of the influence of Jewish elites on that population, on that they actually leaned quite heavily to the left. And we can look at some more recent data from the paper, The Jewish Vote, Political Power and Identity in U.S. Elections, again, by Jewish organizations and a program for American Jewish Studies. This is not something from the Daily Stormer or something like that. But the data they talk about in this paper show that if you look at the top donors to political parties in the U.S., what you find is that the vast majority of the top donors to the Democrat Party are Jewish, and the vast majority of the top donors to the Republican Party are not. Now, in a sense, none of this should be surprising. Jewish people are very successful in our society, and they're very liberal. So if you look at, elite people that are very liberal, a lot of them are Jewish. And it shouldn't be surprising that they're quite liberal. Immigrant groups in a lot of places tend to be quite liberal, especially ones that feel that they have a history of persecution, and Jewish people have existed as an immigrant group, defining itself in part in terms of its history of persecution for a very, very long time. But the fact is that this issue is made so difficult to talk about, it's so taboo, that it drives a lot of people crazy. I know personally a fair number of people who have been driven moderately crazier than they used to be by looking into issues surrounding Jewish individuals and their influence in the world. And I think, unfortunately, because there are so very few people who will talk about this issue in a responsible way, it's overwhelmingly dominated by people who will either talk about it not at all, right, in that kind of irresponsible way of just calling anyone a Nazi who talks about this, or people who are Nazis talking about this, who say, insane things about Jewish people. And, when I talk about Jewish people having an influence on this country that moved it significantly to the left relative to what it would have been because of the representation in our elite class, the fact is, I even have mixed feelings about that, because there are some issues that I have conservative views on, and there are some issues that I have liberal views on. But the problematic element of the left that is relevant to this discussion that we're having today is the anti-white racial bias that the left exudes. Now, this is super obvious, right? Like, if you just listen to leftists talk about race, if you read the New York Times consistently for a few months or something like this, like, it's very easy, it's kind of hard to miss that they just don't like white people. That just is what it is. But there's also been a lot of research done on this. Research finding that liberals are more willing to kill someone for the greater good if that person is a white-sounding name rather than a black-sounding one. That liberals think that it is more plausible that black people are genetically superior to white people than vice versa. That hearing leftist rhetoric about racial privilege makes people feel less sympathy for poor white people. And if you just ask people how they feel about racial groups, white liberals are the only group that just say on net they prefer other groups to their own. And then obviously the other non-white groups do as well. And so what you have in the left is a bunch of people who, white liberals and non-white normal people, all of which prefer some group other than white people over white people. And so it is just true that on top of ethnic diversity having these negative effects in terms of the mental well-being and social cohesion of people in society, crime rates, school satisfaction, that sort of thing, that ethnic diversity, in the case of like Hispanic people and black people and how they voted, and Jewish people and how they've influenced the elite circles of society, that diversity has empowered an ideology which furthers a racial animus towards white people. And that's just, there could be a million horrible mass shootings, and that would still just be true. And as it is, that can be true, and most people that know this stuff, right, do not ever do anything violent. And in part because you can live a deeply satisfying and fulfilling life in a society that has a lot of people that don't like you. That's honestly, it's just not that hard to do. You can have a good life even with bad political stuff going on. And if you don't feel like you can, then you should run from politics as fast as you can and try to forget everything you ever learned about it. Now, that said, there are a bunch of differences which the shooter talked about in his manifesto. Now, he didn't say much particularly compelling about any of this. As we've reviewed, that kid was not particularly bright, and he was only 18. I mean, who has a strong understanding of any research literature when they're 18? Roughly no one. But then again, most people aren't so dumb as to feel, well, the kid's a bad apple. let's just put it that way. But even with him being, a bad apple and saying dumb things and doing horrible things, it's still just true that if you measure things like intelligence, behavioral propensities towards violence and antisocial personality, if you measure these things and then add them to the normal things we control for when trying to measure racial bias, what ends up happening is that black people now have a higher income than white people do. They have higher levels of educational attainment than white people do. They are less likely to get the death penalty than white people are. And differences in things like arrest rates, incarceration rates, and sentencing rates just go away. Now, like I said, that kid said some dumb stuff, and he was no expert on race and IQ, but there are surveys of people that are experts. And what they find is that almost none of them think that the black-white intelligence difference is just due to the environment. This is a minority fringe position taken by people who, frankly, are obviously extremely politically motivated. And I want to briefly touch on why it is that the experts think that, because we don't need to be hearing about this issue from science-denying leftists on the one hand and deranged homicidal lunatics on the other, right? That's not the ideal two groups to hear about this issue from. And so to do this, really briefly, just some major highlights, so to speak, we have to mention the Minnesota transracial adoption study. You take a bunch of black kids, raise them in a white home. You still end up at the 16-point IQ gap between them that we see in the general population, with mixed-race kids ending up in between. And you look at the genomic evidence, and you find that if you give people ancestry tests, 23andMe type thing, that marginal increases in European ancestry predict higher intelligence scores, and this is true within each ethnic group in the United States, and it's still true if you control for how people racially identify, and their skin color, and their parental education, and their socioeconomic status. And if you look at genes associated with intelligence, and we don't know all the genes that are going to impact intelligence, but we know a lot of gene variants that predict intelligence within each group, right, within each race. And those gene variants and the frequency that each group scores on those gene variants can be combined into a score called a polygenic score, and that score differs by race in the way you would expect. And you can use how populations score in terms of those genetics to predict the national IQ of a country very well. And this remains being true if you control for things like malnutrition, measures of national development, child mortality, and the like, and that controlling for that polygenic score significantly reduces the racial IQ gap, suggesting that those genes are involved in that gap. But people don't talk about any of this, right? And because they don't, as I noted before, if you control for a full set of variables, black people make more than white people do. This was true in the 90s. This data from 1991. It's probably much more true now. As everyone knows, you look at college admissions. If they were just based on test scores, white people would go from 66% of the top 100 schools to 75%. So that, as it already stands, right, because we can't tell the truth about racial differences, and they don't have to be that scary, right? So groups differ. There are smart people and dumb people in every race. There are violent people and unviolent people in every race. Most people in every race are of pretty unremarkable intelligence, but also aren't incredibly stupid. Most people are not particularly violent, and you should treat everyone with respect and decency. This doesn't have to be that big of a scary thing. Diversity causes difficulties. We already have a lot of different groups here, so there's going to be some diversity no matter what, but that doesn't mean we have to shove it down our throat. That certainly doesn't mean we have to pretend that it's a virtue, that it's something we need to maximize in society or something like that, right? And some people really like diversity, and for those people, that's fine. And for other people, they should be left alone to live in pretty non-diverse communities to the degree that they want to. None of this has to be this revolutionary, this crazy. But society lies about this stuff, and because we lie and say there's not even a problem here, we can't even begin to talk about solutions to the problem. And to the degree that we want to decrease political violence in this country, what we need to have happen is an increase in dispassionate, calm discussion of facts about the world, less moralizing, less creating these sort of taboo, weird little communities that people exist in where they have to go to those places to talk about ideas that are controversial instead of being able to talk about them in the open public. But that is the opposite of what the left is doing in response to this. What they are already doing immediately is just trying to further those conditions which brought about this kind of incident to begin with. And I say brought about in a loose kind of way. Of course, all the moral responsibility here is just on that kid. But while that kid is responsible for the murders he committed, our institutions and the people that populate those institutions are responsible for spreading all these lies. And they shouldn't be killed for that, but they should stop telling these lies. And of course, they're not going to do that. And so it's up to other people to point out that what we're being told about racial demographics in this country is just systematically false. And just, once again, an atrocity doesn't stop that from being true. So anyway, that's the video. If you liked it, consider liking and commenting. If you like the channel a lot, consider materially supporting it. And in any case, thanks for watching.